History of the Commune. Prologue. With its bold initiative, its revolutionary instinct, it loses also the consciousness of its force. Instead of representing itself, as it might so well do, it goes about in quest of representatives among the liberals. The friend of the people who will write the history of liberalism in France will save us many a convulsion. Sincere liberalism would be folly in a country where the governing classes, refusing to concede anything, constrain every honest man to become a revolutionist. But it was never anything else than the Jesuitism of liberty, a trick of the bourgeoisie to isolate the workman. From Bailly to Jules Favre, the modernists have masked the maneuvers of despotism, buried our revolutions, conducted the great massacres of proletarians. The old clear-sighted Parisian sections hated them more than the downright reactionists. Twice imperial despotism rehabilitated them, and the small middle class, soon forgetting their true part, accepted as defenders those who pretended to be vanquished like themselves. The men who had made abortive the movement of 1848 and paved the way for the 2nd of December thus became during the darkness which followed it the acclaimed vindicators of ravished liberty. At the first dawn they appeared what they had ever been, the enemies of the working class. Under the empire the left never condescended to concern itself with the interests of the workmen. These liberals never found for them a word, a protestation, even such as the chambers of 1830, 1848, sometimes witnessed. The young lawyers whom they had affiliated to themselves soon revealed their designs, rallying to the liberal empire, some openly, like Olivier and Derriman, others with prudence, like Picard. For the timid or ambitious they founded the Open Left, a bench of candidates for public office, and in 1870 a number of liberals indeed solicited official functions. For the intransigents there was the Closed Left, where the irreconcilable dragons Gambetta, PG7, Cremux, Irago, Peloton guarded the pure principles. The chiefs towered in the center. These two groups of augurs thus held every fraction of bourgeois opposition, the timorous and the intrepid. After the plebiscite they became the Holy Synod, the uncontested chiefs of the small middle class, more and more incapable of governing itself, and alarmed at the socialist movement, behind which they showed it the hand of the emperor. It gave them full powers, shut its eyes, and allowed itself to drift gradually towards the parliamentary empire, big with portfolios for its patrons. The thunderbolt of the defeats galvanized it into life, but only for a moment. At the bidding of the deputies to keep quiet, the small middle class, the mother of the 10th of August, docilely bent its head and let the foreigner plunge his sword into the very bosom of France. Poor France! Who will save thee? The humble, the poor, those who for 6 years contended for thee with the empire, while the upper classes sell the nation for a few hours of rest, and the liberals seek to feather their nests under the empire. A handful of men, without arms, unprotected, rise up against the still all-powerful despot. On the one hand, young men who form the bourgeoisie have gone over to the people, faithful children of 1789, resolved to continue the work of the revolution. On the other hand, working men unite for the study and the conquest of the rights of labor. In vain the empire attempts to split their forces, to seduce the working men. These see the snare, hiss the professors of Khazarian socialism, and from 1863, without journals, without a tribune, affirm themselves as a class, to the great scandal of the liberal sycophants, maintaining that 1789 has equalized all classes. In 1867 they descend into the streets, make a manifestation at the tomb of Manin, and, despite the bludgeons of the sbirri, protest against Montana. At this appearance of a revolutionary socialist party the left gnashes its teeth. When some working men, ignorant of their own history, ask Jules Favre if the liberal bourgeoisie will support them on the day of their rising for the Republic, the leader of the left impudently answers, "Gentlemen workmen, you have made the empire, it, PG8, is your business to unmake it." And Picard says, "Socialism does not exist, or at any rate we will not treat with it." Thus set right for the future, the working men continue the struggle single-handed. Since the reopening of the public meetings they fill the halls, and, in spite of persecution and imprisonment, harass, undermine the empire, taking advantage of every accident to inflict a blow. On the 26th of October 1869 they threatened to march on the Corps Legislatif. In November they insult the Tuileries by the election of Rochefort. In December they goad the government by the Marseillaise. In January 1870, they go 200,000 strong to the funeral of Victor Noir, and, well directed, would have swept away the throne. The left, terrified at this multitude, which threatens to overwhelm them, brands their leaders as desperadoes or as police agents. They, however, keep to the fore, unmasking the left, defying them to discussion, keeping up at the same time a running fire on the empire. They form the vanguard against the plebiscite. At the war rumors they are the first to make a stand. The old dregs of chauvinism, stirred by the Bonapartists, discharge their muddy waters. The liberals remain impassible or applaud. The workingmen stop the way. On the 15th of July, at the very same hour when Olivier from the Tribune invokes war with a light heart, the revolutionary socialists crowd the boulevards crying, "Vive la paix," and singing the Pacific refrain, "Les pupilles sont pour nous des frères et les tyrans des ennemis." From the Château d'Yahoo to the Boulevard Saint-Denis they are applauded, but are hissed in the boulevards Bonne Nouvelle and Montmartre, and come to blows with certain bands shouting for war. The next day they meet again at the Bastille, and parade the streets. Ranvier, a painter on porcelain, well known in PG 9, Belleville, marching at their head with a banner. In the Faubourg Montmartre the sergeants de ville charge them with drawn swords. Unable to influence the bourgeoisie, they turn to the working men of Germany, as they had done in 1869. Brothers, we protest against the war, we who wish for peace, labor, and liberty. Brothers, do not listen to the hirelings who seek to deceive you as to the real wishes of France. Their noble appeal received its reward. In 1869 the students of Berlin had answered the pacific address of the French students with insults. The working men of Berlin in 1870 spoke thus to the working men of France: "We too wish for peace, labor, and liberty. We know that on both sides of the Rhine there are brothers with whom we are ready to die for the universal republic." Great prophetic words. Let them be inscribed on the first page of the golden book just opened by the workmen. Thus towards the end of the empire there was no life, no activity, save in the ranks of the proletariat and the young men of the middle class who had joined them. They alone showed some political courage, and in the midst of the general paralysis of the month of July 1870, they alone found the energy to attempt at least the salvation of France. They lacked authority. They failed to carry with them the small middle class, for which they also combat, because of their utter want of political experience. How could they have acquired it during 80 years, when the ruling class not only withheld light from them, but even the right to enlighten themselves? By an infernal Machiavellism they forced them to grope their way in the dark, so that they might hand them over the more easily to dreamers and sectarians. Under the empire, when the public meetings and journals reappeared, the political education of the workmen had still to be effected. Many, abused by morbid minds, in the belief that their affranchisement depended on a coup de main, gave themselves up to whoever spoke of overthrowing the empire. Others, convinced that even the most thoroughgoing bourgeois were PG 10, hostile to socialism, and only courted the people in furtherance of their ambitious plans, wanted the workmen to constitute themselves into groups independent of all tutelage. These different currents crossed each other. The chaotic state of the Party of Action was laid bare in its journal, the Marseillaise, a hot mishmash of doctrinaires and desperate writers united by hatred of the empire, but without definite views, and above all, without discipline. Much time was wanted to cool down the first effervescence and get rid of the romantic rubbish which 20 years of oppression and want of study had made fashionable. However, the influence of the socialists began to prevail, and no doubt with time they would have classified their ideas, drawn up their program, eliminated the mere spouters, entered upon serious action. Already, in 1869, working men's societies, founded for mutual credit, resistance and study, had united in a federation, whose headquarters were the Place de la Corderie du Temple, the International, setting forth the most adequate idea of the revolutionary movement of our century, under the guidance of Varlin, a bookbinder of rare intelligence, of Duval, Thiers, Frankel, and a few devoted men, was beginning to gain power in France. It also met at the Corderie, and urged on the more slow and reserved workmen's societies. The public meetings of 1870 no longer resembled the earlier ones. The people wanted useful discussions. Men like Miller, Lefrançais, Vermorel, Longut, etc., seriously competed with the mere declaimers. But many years would have been required for the development of the Party of Labour, hampered by young bourgeois adventurers in search of a reputation, encumbered with conspiracy mongers and romantic visionaries, still ignorant of the administrative and political mechanism of the bourgeois regime which they attacked. Just before the war, some discipline was attempted. Some tried to move the deputies of the left, and met them at Kremaux. They found them stupefied, more afraid of a coup d'etat than of the Prussian victories. Kremaux, pressed to act, answered naively, "Let us wait for a new disaster," as, for instance, the fall of Strasbourg. Pg 11. It was indeed necessary to wait, for without these shadows nothing could be done. The small Parisian middle class believed in the extreme left, as it had believed in our armies. Those who wished to do without them failed. On the 14th, the Friends of Blanqui attempted to raise the outlying districts, attack the quarters of the firemen of La Villette, and put the sergeants de ville to flight. Masters of the field, they traversed the boulevard up to Belleville, crying, "Vive la République! Death to the Prussians!" No one joined them. The crowd looked on from afar, astonished, motionless, rendered suspicious by the police agents, who thus drew them off from the real enemy, the Empire. The left pretended to believe in the Prussian agent, to reassure the bourgeoisie, and Gambetta demanded the immediate trial of the prisoners of La Villette. The minister Pelliceo had to remind him that certain forms must be observed, even by military justice. The court-martial condemned 10 to death, although almost all the accused had had nothing to do with the affray. Some true-hearted men, wishing to prevent these executions, went to Michelet, who wrote a touching letter on their behalf. The Empire had no time to carry out the sentences. Since the 25th, MacMahon was leading his army into the snares laid by Moltke. On the 29th, surprised and beaten at Beaumont-el-Argonne, he knew himself overreached, and yet pushed forward. Pelliceo had written to him on the 27th, "If you abandon Bazaine, we shall have the revolution in Paris," and to ward off the revolution he exposed France. On the 30th, he threw his troops into the pit of Sedan. On the 1st of September, the army was surrounded by 200,000 enemies, and 700 cannons crowned the heights. The next day, Napoleon III delivered up his sword to the King of Prussia. The Telegraph announced it. All Europe knew it that same night. The deputies, however, were silent. They remained so on the 3rd. On the 4th only, at midnight, after Paris had passed through a day of feverish excitement, they made up their minds to speak. Jules Favre demanded the abolition of the Empire and a commission charged with the defense, but took care not to touch the chamber. During Pg 12, the day, some men of tried energy had attempted to raise the boulevards, and in the evening an anxious crowd pressed against the railings of the Cour Législative, crying, "Vive la République!" Gambetta met them and said, "You are wrong. We must remain united. Make no revolution." Jules Favre, surrounded on his leaving the chamber, strove to calm the people. If Paris had been guided by the left, France would have capitulated that very hour more shamefully than Napoleon III. But on the morning of the 4th of September, the people assemble, and amongst them National Guards armed with their muskets. The astonished gendarmes give way to them. Little by little the Cour Législative is invaded. At 10 o'clock, notwithstanding the desperate efforts of the left, the crowd fills the galleries. It is time. The chamber, on the point of forming a ministry, try to seize the government. The left support this combination with all its might, waxing indignant at the mere mention of a republic. When that cry bursts forth from the galleries, Gambetta makes unheard of efforts and conjures the people to await the result of the deliberations of the chamber, a result known beforehand. It is the project of M. Thous, a government commission named by the Assembly. Peace demanded and accepted at any price. After that disgrace, the parliamentary monarchy. Happily, a new crowd of invaders bursts its way through the doors, while the occupants of the galleries glide into the hall. The people expel the deputies. Gambetta, forced to the tribune, is obliged to announce the abolition of the empire. The crowd, wanting more than this, asks for the republic, and carries off the deputies to proclaim it at the Hôtel de Ville. This was already in the hands of the people. In the Salle du Trône were some of those who for a month had attempted to rouse public opinion. First on the ground, they might, with a little discipline, have influenced the constitution of the government. The left surprised them haranguing, and, incited by an acclaiming multitude, Jules Favre took the chair, which Miller gave up to him, saying, "At the present moment PG-13, there is but one matter at stake, the expulsion of the Prussians. 4. Jules Favre, Jules Simon, Jules Ferry, Gambetta, Cremux, Emmanuel Arago, Blaise Bizoin, Peloton, Garnier Pages, Picard, uniting, proclaimed themselves the government, and read their own names to the crowd, which answered by adding those of men like Delescluze, Ledru Rollin, Blanqui. They, however, declared they would accept no colleagues but the deputies of Paris. The crowd applauded. This frenzy of just emancipated serfs made the left masters. They were clever enough to admit Rochefort. They next applied to General Trochu, named governor of Paris by Napoleon. This general had become the idol of the liberals because he had sulked a little with the empire. 5. His whole military glory consisted in a few pamphlets. The left had seen much of him during the last crisis. Having attained to power, it begged him to direct the defense. He asked, firstly, a place for God in the new regime. Secondly, for himself the presidency of the council. He obtained everything. The future will show what secret bond so quickly united the men of the left to the loyal Breton who had promised to die on the steps of the Tuileries in defense of the dynasty. 6. 12 individuals thus took possession of France. They invoked no other title than their mandate as representatives of Paris, and declared themselves legitimate by popular acclamation. In the evening the International and syndicates of the workmen sent delegates to the Hôtel de Ville. They had on the same day sent a new address to the German PG-14 workingmen. Their fraternal duty fulfilled, the French workmen gave themselves up to the defense. Let the government organize it and they would stay by it. The most suspicious were taken in. On the 7th, in the first number of his paper La Patrie en Danger, Blanqui and his friends offered the government their most energetic, their absolute cooperation. All Paris abandoned itself to the men of the Hôtel de Ville, forgetting their late defections, investing them with the grandeur of the danger. To seize, to monopolize the government at such a moment, seemed a stroke of audacity of which genius alone is capable. Paris, deprived for 80 years of her municipal liberties, accepted as mayor the lachrymose Etienne Arago. In the 20 arrondissements he named the mayors he liked, and they again named the adjuncts agreeable to themselves. But Arago announced early elections and spoke of reviving the great days of 1792. At this moment Jules Favre, proud as Danton, cried to Prussia, to Europe, "We will cede neither an inch of our territories nor a stone of our fortresses," and Paris rapturously applauded this dictatorship announcing itself with words so heroic. On the 14th, when Trochu held the review of the National Guard, 250,000 men stationed in the boulevards, the Place de la Concorde, and the Champs-Élysées cheered enthusiastically, and renewed a vow like that of their fathers on the morning of Valmy. Yes, Paris gave herself up without reserve, incurable confidence, to that same left to which she had been forced to do violence in order to make her revolution. Her outburst of will lasted but for an hour. The empire once overthrown, she re-abdicated. In vain did far-seeing patriots try to keep her on the alert. In vain did Blanqui write, "Paris is no more impregnable than we were invincible." Paris, mystified by a braggart press, ignores the greatness of the peril. Paris abuses confidence. Paris abandoned herself to her new masters, obstinately shutting her eyes. And yet each day brought with it new ill omens. The shadow of the siege, PG-15, approached, and the government of defense, far from removing the superfluous mouths, crowded the 200,000 inhabitants of the suburbs into the town. The exterior works did not advance. Instead of throwing all Paris into the work, and taking these descendants of the levelers of the Champ de Mars out of the enceinte in troops of 100,000, drums beating, banners flying, Trochu abandoned the earthworks to the ordinary contractors. The heights of Chatillon, the key to our forts of the south, had hardly been surveyed, when on the 19th the enemy presented himself, sweeping from the plateau an affrighted troop of Zouaves and soldiers who did not wish to fight. The following day, that Paris which the press had declared could not be invested, was surrounded and cut off from France. This gross ignorance very soon alarmed the revolutionists. They had promised their support, but not blind faith. Since the 4th of September, wishing to centralize the forces of the Party of Action for the Defense and the Maintenance of the Republic, They had invited the public meetings in each arrondissement to name a committee of vigilance charged to control the mayors and to delegate 4 members to a central committee of the 20 arrondissements. This tumultuous mode of election had resulted in a committee composed of working men, employees, authors, known in the revolutionary movements of the last years. This committee had established itself in the hall of the Rue de la Corderie, lent by the International and the Federation of the Syndicates. These had almost suspended their work, the service of the National Guard absorbing all their activity. Some of their members again met in the Committee of Vigilance and in the Central Committee, which caused the latter to be erroneously attributed to the International. On the 4th it demanded by a manifesto the election of the municipalities, the police to be placed in their hands, the election and control of all the magistrates, absolute freedom of the press, public meeting and association, the expropriation of all articles of primary necessity, their distribution by allowance, the arming of all citizens, the sending of commissioners to rouse the provinces. pg 16. But Paris was then infected with a fit of confidence. The bourgeois journals denounced the committee as Prussian. The names of some of the signers were, however, well known in the meetings and to the press: Ranvier, Miller, Longut, Vallas, Lefrançais, Malin, etc. Their placards were torn down. On the 20th, after Jules Favre's application to Bismarck, the committee held a large meeting in the Alcazar and sent a deputation to the Hôtel de Ville to demand war outrance and the early election of the Commune of Paris. Jules Ferry gave his word of honor that the government would not treat at any price, and announced the municipal elections for the end of the month. 2 days after, a decree postponed them indefinitely. Thus this government, which in 17 days had prepared nothing, which had allowed itself to be blocked up without even a struggle, refused the advice of Paris, and more than ever arrogated to itself the right of directing the defense. Did it then possess the secret of victory? Trochu had just said, "The resistance is a heroic madness. Picard, we shall defend ourselves for honor's sake, but all hope is chimerical." The elegant Kremux. The Prussians will enter Paris like a knife goes into butter. 7. The chief of Trochu's staff. We cannot defend ourselves. We have decided not to defend ourselves. 8. And, instead of honestly warning Paris, saying, "Capitulate at once or conduct the combat yourselves," these men who declared defense impossible, claimed its undivided direction. What then is their aim? To negotiate. Since the first defeats they have no other. The reverses which exalted our fathers only made the left more cowardly than the imperialist deputies. On the 7th of August, Jules Favre, Jules Simon, and Peloton had said to Schneider, "We cannot hold out. We must come to terms as soon as possible." 9. All the following days the left had only one plan of policy: to urge pg 17. The chamber to possess itself of the government in order to negotiate, hoping to get into office afterwards. Hardly established, these defenders sent embassies all over Europe to beg for peace, and Jules Favre to run off to Bismarck to ask his conditions. 10. A step that revealed to the Prussian with what tremblers he had to deal. When all Paris cried to them, "Defend us, drive back the enemy," they applauded, accepted, but said to themselves, "You shall capitulate." There is no more crying treason in history. The asinine confidence of the immense majority no more diminishes the crime than the foolishness of the dupe excuses the cheater. Did the men of the 4th of September, yes or no, betray the mandate they received? Yes, will be the verdict of the future. A tacit mandate, it is true, but so clear, so formal, that all Paris started at the news of the proceedings at Ferrières. If the defenders had gone a step farther, they would have been swept away. They were obliged to adjourn, to give way to what they termed the madness of the siege, to simulate a defense. In point of fact, they did not abandon their idea for an hour, esteeming themselves the only men in Paris who had not lost their heads. There shall be fighting since those Parisians will have it so, but only with the view to soften Bismarck. On his return from the review, this scene of hopeful enthusiasm manifested by 250,000 armed men is said to have affected Trochu, who announced that it would perhaps be possible to hold the ramparts. 11. Such was the maximum of his enthusiasm, to hold out, not to open the gates. As to drilling or organizing these 250,000 men, uniting them with the 240,000 mobiles, soldiers and marines gathered together in Paris, and with all these forces forming a powerful scourge to drive the enemy back to the Rhine, Of this he never dreamt. His colleagues thought of it as little, and only discussed with him. PG 18. The more or less cavilling they might venture upon with the Prussian invader, he was all for mild proceedings. His devoutness forbade him to shed useless blood, since, according to all military manuals, the great town was to fall. He would make that fall as little sanguinary as possible. Besides, the return of M. Thous, who might at any moment bring back the treaty, was waited for, leaving the enemy to establish himself tranquilly round Paris. Trochu organized a few skirmishes for the lookers-on. One single serious engagement took place on the 30th at Cheverly, when, after a success, we retreated, abandoning a battery for want of reinforcements and teams. Public opinion still hoaxed by the same men that had cried, "A Berlin," believed in a success. The revolutionists only were not taken in. The capitulation of Toul and of Strasbourg was to them a solemn warning. Florence, chief of the 63D Battalion, but who was the real commander of Belleville, could no longer restrain himself. With the head and heart of a child, an ardent imagination, guided only by his own impulse, Florence conducted his battalions to the Hôtel de Ville, demanded the levée en masse, sorties, municipal elections, and the putting the town on short rations. Trochu, who, to amuse him, had given him the title of Major of the Rampart, made an elaborate discourse. The 12 apostles argued with him, and wound up by showing him out, as delegates came from all sides to demand that Paris should have a voice in her own defense, should name a council, her commune. The government declared on the 7th that their dignity forbade them to concede these behests. This insolence caused the movement of the 8th of October. The committee of the 20 arrondissements protested in an energetic placard. 700 or 800 persons cried "Vive la Commune" under the windows of the Hôtel de Ville, but the multitude had not yet lost faith. A great number of battalions hastened to the rescue. The government passed them in review. Jules Favre opened the floodgates of his rhetoric and declared the election impossible because, unanswerable reason, everybody ought to be at the ramparts. PG 19. The majority greedily swallowed the bait. On the 16th, Trochu, having written to his crony Etienne Arago, "I shall pursue the plan I have traced for myself to the end." The loungers announced a victory, and took up the burden of their August song on Bazaine. Let him alone. He has his plan. The agitators looked like Prussians. For Trochu, as a good Jesuit, had not failed to speak of a small number of men whose culpable views serve the projects of the enemy. Then Paris allowed herself during the whole month of October to be rocked asleep to the sound of expeditions commencing with success and always terminated by retreats. On the 13th we took Bagneux, and a spirited attack would have repossessed us of Chatillon. Trochu had no reserves. On the 21st a march on the Malmaison revealed the weakness of the investment and spread panic even to Versailles. Instead of pressing forward, General Ducrot engaged only 6,000 men, and the enemy repulsed him, taking 2 cannons. The government transformed these repulses into successful reconnoiters, and coined money out of the despatches of Gambetta, who, sent to the provinces on the 8th, announced imaginary armies, and intoxicated Paris with the account of the brilliant defense of Châteaudun. The mayors encouraged this pleasant confidence. They sat at the Hôtel de Ville with their adjuncts, and this assembly of 64 members could have seen clearly what the defense was if they had had the least courage. But it was composed of those liberals and republicans of whom the left is the last expression. They knocked at the door of the government now and then, timidly interrogated it, and received only vague assurances, in which they did not believe. 12. But made every effort to make Paris believe. But at the Corderie, in the clubs, in the paper of Blanqui, PG 20, in the Réveil of Delescluze, in the combat of Félix Pyot, the plan of the men of the Hôtel de Ville is exposed. What mean these partial sorties which are never sustained? Why is the National Guard hardly armed, unorganized, withheld from every military action? Why is the casting of cannon not proceeded with? 6 weeks of idle talk and inactivity cannot leave the least doubt as to the incapacity or ill will of the government. This same thought occupies all minds. Let the sceptics make room for those that believe in the defense. Let Paris regain possession of herself. Let the Commune of 1792 be revived to again save the city and France. Every day this resolution sinks more deeply into virile minds. On the 27th, the combat, which preached the commune in high-flown phraseology whose musical rhythm struck the masses more than the nervous dialectics of Blanqui, hurls a terrific thunderbolt. Bazaine is about to surrender Metz, to treat for peace in the name of Napoleon III. His aide-de-camp is at Versailles. The Hôtel de Ville immediately contradicted this news, as infamous as it is false. The glorious soldier Bazaine has not ceased harassing the besieging army with brilliant sorties. The government called down upon the journalist the chastisement of public opinion. At this appeal the drones of Paris buzzed, burnt the journal, and would have torn the journalist to pieces if he had not decamped. The next day the combat declared that they had the statement from Rochefort, to whom Florence had communicated it. Other complications followed. On the 20th a surprise made us masters of Bourget, a village in the northeast of Paris, and on the 29th the General Staff announced this success as a triumph. The whole day it left our soldiers without food, without reinforcements, under the fire of the Prussians, who, returning on the 30th 15,000 strong, recovered the village from its 1,600 defenders. On the 31st of October, Paris on awaking received the news of three disasters: the loss of Bourget, the capitulation of Metz, together with the whole army of the glorious Bazaine, and the arrival of Amaury for the purpose of negotiating an armistice. PG 21. The men of the 4th of September believed they were saved, that their goal was reached. They had placarded the armistice side by side with the capitulation. Good and bad news. 13. Convinced that Paris, despairing of victory, would accept peace with open arms. Paris started up as with an electric shock, at the same time rousing Marseillaises, Toulouse, and Saint-Étienne. There was such spontaneity of indignation, that from 11 o'clock, in pouring rain, the masses came to the Hôtel de Ville crying no armistice. Notwithstanding the resistance of the mobiles who defended the entrance, they invaded the vestibule. Arago and his adjuncts hastened thither, swore that the government was exhausting itself in efforts to save us. The first crowd retired, a second followed hard upon. At 12 o'clock Trochu appeared at the foot of the staircase, thinking to extricate himself by a harangue. Cries of "Down with Trochu" answered him. Jules Simon relieved him, and, confident in his rhetoric, even went to the square in front of the Hôtel de Ville and expatiated upon the comforts of the armistice. The people cried no armistice. He only succeeded in backing out by asking the crowd to name 6 delegates to accompany him to the Hôtel de Ville. Trochu, Jules Favre, Jules Ferry, and Picard received them. Trochu in Ciceronic periods demonstrated the uselessness of Bourget, and pretended that he had only just learned the capitulation of Metz. A voice cried, "You are a liar." A deputation from the committee of the 20 arrondissements and of the committees of vigilance had entered the hall a little while before. Others, wishing to pump Trochu, invited him to continue his speech. He recommenced, when a shot was fired in the square, putting an end to the monologue and scaring away the orator. Calm being re-established, Jules Favre supplied the place of the general, and took up the thread of his discourse. While these scenes were going on in the Salle du Trône, the mayors, so long the accomplices of Trochu, were, PG 22, deliberating in the hall of the municipal council. To quell the riot, they proposed the election of municipalities, the formation of battalions of the National Guard, and their joining them to the army. The scapegoat Etienne Eragot was sent to offer this salve to the government. At 2 o'clock an immense crowd inundated the Place de la Hôtel de Ville, crying, "Down with Trochu, Vive la Commune," and carrying banners with the inscription "No Armistice." They had several times come into collision with the mobiles. The delegates who entered the Hôtel de Ville brought no answer. About 3 o'clock, the crowd, growing impatient, rushed forward, breaking through the mobiles, and forcing Felix Pathe, come to the Hôtel de Ville as a sightseer, into the Salle des Mares. He exclaimed, struggled, protested that this was against all rules. The mayors supported him as well as they could, and announced that they had demanded the election of the municipalities, and that the decree in that sense was about to be signed. The multitude, still pushing forward, goes up to the Salle du Trône, cutting short the oration of Jules Favre, who had rejoined his colleagues in the government room. While the people were thundering at the door, the defenders voted the proposition of the mayors, but in principle, not fixing the date for the elections. 14. Another Jesuitical trick. Towards 4 o'clock the mass penetrated into the room. Rochefort in vain promised the municipal elections. They asked for the commune. One of the delegates of the Committee of the 20 Arrondissements, getting upon the table, proclaimed the abolition of the government. A commission was charged to proceed with the elections within 48 hours. The names of Dorian, the only minister who had taken the defense to heart, of Louis Blanc, Ledru Rollin, Victor Hugo, Raspail, Delescluze, Felix Pyat, Blanqui and Miller were received with acclamation. Had this commission seized on authority, cleared the Hôtel de Ville, posted up a proclamation convoking the PG23 electors with the briefest delay, the day's work would have been beneficially concluded. But Dorian refused. Louis Blanc, Victor Hugo, Ledru Rollin, Raspail, Felix Pyat remained silent or turned tail altogether. Flourens had time to come up. He broke in upon the assembly with his tirailleurs of Belleville, got upon the table round which were gathered the members of the government, and instead of a commune proposed a committee of public safety. Some applauded, others protested, declaring the question was not to substitute one kind of dictatorship for another. Flourens got the upper hand. Read the names. His own first, then those of Blanqui, Delescluze, Miller, Ranvier, Felix Pyat, and Motu. Interminable discussions followed. The disorder became terrible. The men of the 4th of September felt they were saved, and smiled as they looked at the conquerors who allowed victory to slip through their fingers. Thenceforth all became involved in an inextricable imbroglio. Every room had its government, its orators. The confusion was such that about 8 o'clock reactionary National Guards could, under Flourens' nose, pick up Trochu and Jules Ferry, while others carried off Blanqui when some franc tireurs tried to rescue him. In the cabinet of the mayor, Etienne Arago and his adjuncts convoked the electors for the next day under the presidency of Dorian and Schulcher. Towards 10 o'clock their placard was posted up in Paris. The whole day Paris had looked on. On the morning of the 31st of October, says Jules Ferry, the Parisian population, from highest to lowest, was absolutely hostile to us. 15 Everybody thought we deserved to be dismissed. Not only did Trochu's battalions not stir, but one of the best, led to the succor of the government by General Tamisier, Commander-in-Chief of the National Guard, raised the butt end of their guns on arriving at the Place de l'Hôtel de Ville. In the evening everything changed when it became known that the members of the government were prisoners, and PG24, above all who were their substitutes. The measure seemed too strong. Such a one, who might have accepted Ledru Rollin or Victor Hugo, could not make up his mind to Flourens and Blanqui. 16. In vain the whole day drums had been beating to arms. In the evening they proved effective. Battalions refractory in the morning arrived at the Place Vendôme, most of them believing, it is true, that the elections had been granted. An assemblage of officers at the Bourse only consented to wait for the regular vote on the strength of Dorian and Schulcher's placard. Trochu and the deserters from the Hôtel de Ville again found their faithful flock. The Hôtel de Ville, on the other hand, was getting empty. Most of the battalions of the Commune, believing their cause victorious, had returned to their quarters. In the edifice there remained hardly 1,000 unarmed men, the only troops being Flourens' unmanageable tirailleurs. While he wandered up and down amidst this mob, Blanqui signed and again signed. Delescluze tried to save some remnants from this great movement. He saw Dorian, received the formal assurance that the elections of the Commune would take place the next day, those of the Provisional Government the day after. Put these assurances upon record in a note where the Insurrectional Committee declared itself willing to wait for the elections, and had it signed by Miller, Flourens and Blanqui. Miller and Dorian went to communicate this document to the members of the defense. Miller proposed to them to leave the Hôtel de Ville together, while charging Dorian and Schulcher to proceed with the elections, but on the express condition that no prosecutions were to take place. The members of the defense accepted. 17. And Miller was, PG 25, just saying to them, "Gentlemen, you are free." When the National Guards asked for written engagements, the prisoners became indignant that their word should be doubted, while Miller and Flourens could not make the guards understand that signatures are illusory. During this mortal anarchy the battalions of order grew larger, and Jules Ferry attacked the door opening onto the Place Lobor. Delescluze and Dorian informed him of the arrangement which they believed concluded, and induced him to wait. At 3 o'clock in the morning chaos still reigned supreme. Trochu's drums were beating on the Place de l'Hôtel de Ville. A battalion of Breton mobiles debouched in the midst of the Hôtel de Ville through the subterranean passage of the Napoleon barracks, surprised and disarmed many of the tirailleurs. Jules Ferry invaded the government room. The indisciplinable mass offered no resistance. Jules Favre and his colleagues were set free. As the Bretons became menacing, General Tamassia reminded them of the convention entered upon during the evening, and, as a pledge of mutual oblivion, left the Hôtel de Ville between Blanqui and Florence. Trochu paraded the streets amidst the pompous pageantry of his battalions. Thus this day, which might have buoyed up the defense, ended in smoke. The desultoriness, the indiscipline of the patriots restored to the government its immaculate character of September. It took advantage of it that very night to tear down the placards of Dorian and Schulcher. It accorded the municipal elections for the 5th, but in exchange demanded a plebiscite, putting the question in the imperialist style. Those who wish to maintain the government will vote aye. In vain the committee of the 20 arrondissements issued a manifesto. In vain the Réveil, the Patrie in danger, the combat, enumerated the 100 reasons which made it necessary to answer no. 6 months after the plebiscite which had made the war, the immense majority of Paris voted the plebiscite that made the capitulation. Let Paris remember and accuse herself. For fear of 2 or 3 men she opened fresh credit to this government which added PG 26, incapacity to insolence, and said to it, I want you, 322,000 times. The army, the mobiles, gave 237,000 eyes. There were but 54,000 civilians and 9,000 soldiers to say boldly, no. How did it happen that those 60,000 men, so clear-sighted, prompt, and energetic, could not manage to direct public opinion, simply because they were wanting in cadre?